Two different black women's experiences were about to clash that night. Owens, conservative media darling, someone who criticized the system but benefited from its advantages. Crockett, someone who did real community work, coming from grassroots activism. While Owens criticized identity politics, Crockett was about to expose how Owens had monetized her own identity. The grand ballroom of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., buzzed with anticipation on that crisp October evening. The ornate chandeliers cast dramatic shadows over an audience that included political operatives, journalists, and policy experts who had gathered for what was being billed as the Great Debate: Identity, Politics, and the Future of American Democracy. On one side of the mahogany podium stood Candace Owens, the 34-year-old conservative commentator whose transformation from liberal blogger to right-wing media star had made her one of the most recognizable voices in American political discourse. Immaculately dressed in a tailored red blazer that matched her signature bold lipstick, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had built a career on being provocative and unafraid. On the other side stood Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, wearing an understated navy suit that projected professional authority without flash. At 43, she brought to this debate not just political experience, but the deep community organizing background that had shaped her approach to both law and legislation. The contrast between them was striking, not just in their political philosophies, but in their very presence. Owens projected the polished media persona of someone who had mastered the art of television performance. Crockett carried the grounded authority of someone who had spent years in courtrooms and community centers, dealing with real problems affecting real people. The moderator, veteran journalist Anderson Cooper, introduced the evening's topic. Tonight, we examine one of the most contentious issues in contemporary American politics, the role of racial identity in political discourse and policymaking. Owens was given the opening statement, and she launched into familiar territory with practiced ease. Thank you, Anderson. I want to begin by addressing the elephant in the room. The Democratic Party's obsession with racial identity politics, Owens said, her voice carrying the theatrical confidence that had made her a star on conservative media. For too long, the left has convinced black Americans that they are victims, that they cannot succeed without government handouts, and that their skin color defines their political interests. This is not just wrong, it's insulting. She gestured toward the audience with the kind of sweeping motion that played well on television. The Democratic Party has created what I call the liberal plantation, a system that keeps black Americans dependent on government programs, while convincing them that independence and conservative values are somehow betrayals of their racial identity. It was vintage Owens, provocative, sweeping, designed to generate both applause from supporters and outrage from critics. Representative Crockett, she continued, turning toward her opponent, represents everything that's wrong with this approach. She uses her position to promote racial grievance politics instead of encouraging black Americans to take personal responsibility for their success. When Cooper turned to Crockett for her response, she didn't take the bait to respond defensively. Instead, she pulled out a folder from her briefcase and opened it deliberately. Thank you, Anderson. Ms. Owens has made some interesting claims about identity politics and personal responsibility. I'd like to examine those claims in the context of actual experience and actual results. Crockett's tone was measured, professional, almost conversational. Ms. Owens, you speak eloquently about the dangers of racial identity politics, but I'm curious about your own relationship with identity and politics. Owens raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this line of inquiry. According to my research, Crockett continued, consulting her notes, you built your entire career on your identity as a black conservative woman. Your book deals, speaking fees, and media contracts all center on the marketability of that specific identity. She looked up at Owens. How much money have you made from being the black conservative voice that conservative media was looking for? The question hit the room like a thunderclap. Owens's confident demeanor flickered slightly. Representative Crockett, my success comes from my ideas, not my race. Does it? Crockett interrupted gently. Because when Turning Point USA hired you, Their internal communications, which became public through a lawsuit, specifically mentioned recruiting you as the black female voice we need to counter liberal narratives about race. She turned to another page in her folder. Your speaking fees at conservative events are 40% higher than white conservative speakers with similar experience levels. Your book deal was marketed specifically as a black woman's journey from liberal plantation to conservative freedom. Crockett looked directly at Owens. Ms. Owens, it seems like you've monetized your racial identity more successfully than most people you criticize for playing identity politics. Owens was clearly rattled, but tried to regain her footing. Representative, there's a difference between having conservative values as a black woman and using race as a crutch. Is there? Crockett asked. Because let's examine what you call using race as a crutch versus what you call conservative values. She pulled out another document. In your public statements, you've criticized Black Lives Matter activists for making everything about race. But when conservative organizations want to promote their message to black audiences, they pay you substantial fees specifically because of your race. Crockett's voice grew stronger. You've criticized black politicians for playing the race card, but your entire career is built on playing a different kind of race card, the "I'm not like those other black people" card. The audience was completely silent now, sensing that this had moved beyond typical political debate into something much more personal and pointed. Ms. Owens, Crockett continued, you speak about the liberal plantation, but let me ask you about your actual experience with black communities. She consulted her notes again. When was the last time you lived in a majority black neighborhood? When was the last time you worked directly with black families facing economic hardship? When was the last time you participated in community organizing that wasn't related to promoting conservative ideology? Owens looked trapped. Representative, I don't think where someone lives determines their authenticity. You're absolutely right, Crockett agreed. But experience does matter when you're making claims about what black Americans need and want. She stood up from her podium, a move that surprised both Owens and the moderator. Ms. Owens, you criticize what you call identity politics. But let me share some actual experience with identity and politics. Crockett's voice took on the rhythm of someone who had given this speech before, but never in quite these circumstances. I grew up in a working-class black neighborhood in Dallas. My mother cleaned office buildings at night so she could be home when I got out of school. My father worked construction and came home every day covered in concrete dust. She moved closer to the center of the stage. When I became a prosecutor, I didn't do it because of identity politics. I did it because I saw young black men getting railroaded by a system that didn't care about their lives or their futures. Her voice grew more passionate. When I defended families facing foreclosure, it wasn't racial grievance politics. It was recognizing that predatory lending specifically targeted black homeowners because banks knew they had less political power to fight back. Crockett turned to face Owens directly. When I work on criminal justice reform, it's not because I'm obsessed with race. It's because I've seen how broken the system is for people who look like me, and like you. She returned to her podium but remained standing. Ms. Owens, you talk about personal responsibility as if it's an alternative to addressing systemic inequality. But what if they're not opposites? What if personal responsibility includes the responsibility to fight systems that make success harder for some people than others? Owens tried to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. You've built a career telling conservative audiences what they want to hear about black Americans. That racism isn't a real barrier, that systemic inequality is a myth, that anyone who talks about these issues is just making excuses. Crockett's voice grew sharper. But that message isn't based on community organizing or policy expertise or working with black families. It's based on what sells books and fills speaking calendars. She pulled out one final document. Ms. Owens, I want to read you something. This is from a family in my district. A black family whose son was killed by police during a traffic stop for a broken taillight. The room was dead silent now. They wrote, Representative Crockett, we don't want revenge or handouts. We just want accountability. We want a system that treats our children like they matter. We want politicians who understand that when we talk about justice, we're not playing politics. We're trying to save lives. Crockett looked up from the letter. Ms. Owens, how do you tell that family that their concern about police accountability is just identity politics? How do you tell them they should focus on personal responsibility when their son was killed for a broken taillight? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Owens's voice was shaky when she finally responded. Representative, obviously every death is tragic, but we can't use individual cases to indict entire systems. Individual cases? Crockett's voice rose for the first time. Ms. Owens, are you aware that this isn't an individual case? Are you aware of the statistical patterns of police violence, the data on traffic stops, the research on sentencing disparities? She pulled out her phone and consulted a note. Or do you dismiss all of that as liberal propaganda because it doesn't fit your narrative? Crockett's tone shifted back to professional, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Ms. Owens, this is the difference between us. You've built a career on telling people what they want to hear about race in America. I've built a career on dealing with what race in America actually looks like. She gestured toward the audience. You give speeches about the liberal plantation to rooms full of people who have never experienced the economic and social challenges facing black communities. I work with families who are living those challenges every day. Crockett's voice grew stronger again. You criticize identity politics while monetizing your own identity for conservative audiences. I work on policies that address real problems affecting real people, regardless of whether it fits a particular political narrative. She sat back down, but kept her eyes on Owens. Ms. Owens, the difference between us isn't our race or our politics. It's that I do the work and you perform the work. The silence that followed was profound. Owens sat at her podium looking smaller than she had at the beginning of the evening, her usual confidence replaced by visible discomfort. When Anderson Cooper tried to move the debate to other topics, the energy had fundamentally shifted. Owens's responses became more defensive, less polished. She had been exposed not as a fraud, but as someone who had built a career on critiquing communities she had disconnected herself from. But perhaps the most telling moment came during the final question period, when a young black woman in the audience asked both participants what advice they would give to someone trying to make a difference in their community. Owens gave a polished response about individual achievement and conservative values. When it was Crockett's turn, she said simply, "Get involved, show up, listen more than you speak. And remember that making a difference isn't about having the right opinions, it's about doing the work." As the debate ended and the audience filed out, something had changed. Not just in how people saw the two participants, but in how they understood the difference between performing authenticity and living it. 3 weeks later, Candace Owens quietly canceled several speaking engagements and took what her representatives called a strategic pause from media appearances. Crockett, meanwhile, returned to Texas and continued the community organizing work that had brought her to politics in the first place. Because in the end, the most powerful response to performance isn't counter-performance, it's substance. And substance, as Crockett had demonstrated, doesn't require an audience to validate its authenticity. If this story reminded you that real change comes from real work, not just real opinions, make sure to subscribe for more stories of people who prove that the most important political battles aren't fought on stages. They're fought in communities, with communities, for communities.